Good afternoon. My name is Al Martinez-Fonts. I'm the Executive Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. For those of you that may not be familiar with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, it's a fairly newly created organization. We came into being on January 1st of this year, and our role is to oversee the work of all the 501c3s that are here at the Chamber. Among them, BCLC, the Business Civic Leadership Center, for whose event you're here, but it also includes organizations like Hiring Our Heroes, the Institute for Organizational Management, the Institute for a Competitive Workforce, the Center for Women in Business, our Emerging Issues Group, and so on. So we oversee all of that work, and in addition to that, I am also the acting executive director of BCLC. So I'm here to welcome you with all of those hats, so hopefully you feel very welcome to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. When I heard that we were doing an event called Bricks and Sticks, I asked the question, so where do we get this name from? And maybe those of you that are in this business would say this really makes all the sense in the world, but it really has to do with bricks, things that are man-made, and sticks, things that belong to nature. And how do we coordinate and how do we work together between the things that we as human beings have made on the earth and the earth itself? So that's all the lecturing you're getting from me. My role here is to introduce Bill Shireman, CEO of Future 500, who is going to lead the first panel. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bill. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Al. We appreciate everyone's participation in the discussion today. From 2008 to 2010, energy activism in the U.S. was divided between two movements. There was the mainstream movement, which was led by groups like NRDC and EDF, funded with perhaps $500 million of money from foundations and donors to drive a cap-and-trade solution to the climate problem. On the other hand, there was the grassroots community, the corporate campaign community, that was more groups like Greenpeace, Sierra Club, groups that have more power over corporate reputation and brand value than they do over lawmakers. And they were more focused on command and control, regulations, a carbon tax, and approaches like that. In that vying for influence, it was the mainstream groups that carried the day, and they pushed forward on an agenda for cap and trade. When the cap and trade bill lost, that triggered a period of clinical depression, if you will, in the environmental movement. It was a terrible crashing defeat for folks that had gained some optimism that things would be different under the Obama administration. What broke that depression was the early victory that environmentalists had over the Keystone Pipeline. When that pipeline was, at least initially in its first phase, stopped, it injected a burst of new enthusiasm into the environmental movement. It also validated the critique that some in the community had of the cap-and-trade movement, that it was too collaborative, that it didn't use the adversarial tools that the environmental community has, and that the adversarial process could be more successful. And so what we've seen since then is a movement that is more focused on the adversarial, more focused on stopping projects than on advancing projects. Ahead, we see four things happening, four policy and advocacy emphases. Number one, litigation to shut down coal plants and other energy facilities. Number two, disruption of demand for and transportation of what the environmental community calls extreme energy. That is oil sands, hydraulic fracturing, deep wells, and so on. Number three, state-focused legislation for renewables, for clean energy, and so on. And number four, hovering behind this, the idea of a tax shift, known in the Beltway as the politically impossible, revenue-neutral carbon tax shift that will never pass. That's the branding that the tax shift has had. And yet it is the most talked about non-viable policy option out there in the community. I'm Bill Shireman. I am very pleased to be with you today. I am CEO of a group called the Future 500. We've been around for about 18 years. And our role is to bring together diametrically opposed, often interest groups, major corporations and activist groups, groups that love to hate and demonize each other and that often carry out very public battles with public agendas that are somewhat different than the private agendas. Our role is to try to bring those parties together. We find that there's at least 80% common ground between these groups that they simply don't see early on, and that by breaking the process of demonization, we can enable each side to engage more rationally with one another and to find common ground. We have two panelists today that play really central roles in the two sources of fuel that have revolutionized the energy market in North America. We have Dan Whitten, Vice President for Strategic Communications at ANGA, America's Natural Gas Alliance. Hydraulic fracturing has, as we all know, completely transformed the natural gas market, and it has shifted the focus of energy development back to North America in ways that almost no one could predict a half a decade ago. ANGA is navigating a very complex field with growing production of natural gas, leading to lower prices than we've seen in many years, and yet a high level of public concern and opposition, particularly in certain regions of the country. And they're navigating this with a very diverse membership set that has different objectives as well. So we're looking forward to hearing from Dan. We also have Gord Lambert, the Vice President for Sustainable Development at Suncor. Oil sands, as you know, is the other half of the North transformation. The Keystone Pipeline has been a focus for opposition. As I said earlier, it was the victory, short-lived, if you will, against the Keystone Pipeline that reanimated the environmental movement and that continues to be a model for activism. Gord is perhaps the most effective and highly respected energy executive in the energy sands arena, even from the environmental group's perspective. He is dedicated to driving that dialogue that I think is the key to solution, and you'll hear a little bit about what he's doing. We had a third panelist whose plane is not in the city that it was supposed to be in at this time, so he's not with us today. That was to be Dan Gilligan, President of National Association of Energy Service Companies. So I will be playing the role of Dan of Don in the discussions today. So I want to give our panelists a little opportunity to introduce themselves and answer the first question, if you will. And I'd like this to be an interactive panel. So while we can certainly have questions at the end, if you have burning questions, raise your hand, and I think we can deal with them as we go. We want this to be interactive. So, Dan, our first question is, what's the role and potential of natural gas in the North American market, both politically and economically?
Well, thanks, Bill. I appreciate you having me here. I just say it's a great time to be in the natural gas business. We are a abundant American clean fuel that's contributing to our economy and contributing to jobs. And you know, despite your introduction as us being one of the flashpoints for some of the opposition on energy, mainstream America actually feels very strongly that natural gas is a substantial part of our clean energy answer going forward. Not the only part. But natural gas provides a lot of opportunities for our nation, and we're starting to see it. Lower energy prices is just one. And so I think as we look at the political landscape, you know, obviously there's risks. There's the tax issues that you mentioned that we're concerned about. There is a regulatory threat on some levels, but the general inclination I've found is that people see this opportunity and want us to take advantage of it. So I just think there's great potential for natural gas, and it's a great climate for natural gas economically in the business community. And despite, with some significant exceptions, it's not a terrible climate politically.
Gord, what's the role of oil sands?
Well, first of all, I'll just acknowledge that I'm here from Calgary, where there's 6 inches of snow in Calgary. This is like our version of summer outside, and quite enjoying that. Having said that, being Canadian, yes, we wear that very proudly. We're a well-governed country. We happen to be the major energy supplier to the U.S., and so, thank you. And that we take that role very seriously. We're very proud of it, and that's not just oil from the oil sands. It's also natural gas, and so that connection to us is just vitally important. And when we frame up our energy challenges looking forward, certainly we would see North America being the playing field in how we define our energy security. We think that we have an abundant supply of energy on a continental level. It's a case of making choices around what forms of energy do we want to take advantage of. But energy, because it's a system, is always about choice. And I think one observation I would make of this current state of discourse is that it's very easy to default to being against different forms of energy. Mm-hmm. But not talking about the consequences of those choices, those positions. Yeah. And more, we're trying to get to dialogue about what are we for versus what are we against. And it's going to mean any form of energy has consequences to it, social and environmental. I think what's very important is that we have an adult conversation about what the consequence of choices are, what's in front of us, and then help to shape the future.
Now, clearly we need to make energy choices, and yet in the political environment that we face right now, we are in a time of gridlock. We're in a time of great adversarialism, with each side kind of working in its silos to develop its narrative. And when it comes to folks that are critical of fossil fuels, the narrative is renewables are the solution. And we need solar, we need wind, we need all the forms of renewables. Is there possible overlap of interest between the natural gas and oil sands communities and these groups? And are renewables a part of that, or are they not?
You want me to start? I'll take a crack at it here. We don't see this as an either-or choice in many respects. So first of all, when it comes to our traditional use of hydrocarbon energy, we do need to produce hydrocarbon energy at a lower environmental footprint, and so I think we have to innovate, and we have to simply drive the performance agenda around hydrocarbon energy aggressively to minimize environmental consequences. But renewable energy has to be a complementary part of the energy system. And diversification of energy sources makes a lot of sense. When we say security of supply is a public interest, well, having diversity in our energy system is very compatible with that. But we can't lose sight of the functional uses of energy. So I often remind folks that in our business, being in the oil sands, our product is all about planes, trains, and automobiles. That's literally the purpose of the form of energy that we produce. Mm-hmm. And solar and wind energy just simply do not translate to that functional use right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could envision electricity entering the mobility realm, but at the scale we're talking of, we think the reliance on hydrocarbon-based fuels is going to be relatively longer term here. We just don't see a viable scenario where we're not going to need fuels for that mobility agenda. But how you use the revenues from these non-renewable resources to help advance R&D and create new options for our energy future, I think is a very important synergy to the renewables agenda and to even some of the advancements we're going to make. So we think the wealth creation capability of these non-renewable resources has to be a really important part of our sustainability dialogue. What worries me in some respects is I don't want to look out 30 years or look back 30 years from now and say we didn't use the revenues from our non-renewable resources wisely. And that dialogue isn't occurring, unfortunately, based on the just simply the environment frame to discussions to date.
Well, that takes us nicely back to natural gas, because a few years ago, natural gas in the environmental community was really a favorite in many respects. And natural gas was seen as the bridge to a renewable energy future. And now there still is support for that, really on the part of most of the funders of energy-related activism. They still see natural gas as the bridge. But there's another set of funders that see natural gas as fundamentally antithetical to clean water, and they tend to be in the banned natural gas community. We need a bridge to whatever future mix of energy we're going to have. Is natural gas that bridge? Is it a bridge that can get us that far?
Yeah, Bill, I want to go to your other question as well. To answer this question, first of all, we don't view natural gas as a bridge. If you look at what the Potential Gas Committee reported just last week, they had a 26% jump in the potential natural gas resource just over last year. There is enough gas in this country and in Canada, by the way, Gord. I didn't mean to sell you short there. Canada is a huge partner for us in all forms of energy. But we have enough for many, many generations, and that's just what we've identified. So we don't really accept the bridge discussion, and that's really important actually to renewables. Natural gas is a source of electricity that you can power on and power off with the flip of a switch. So when the wind's not blowing, when the sun's not shining, natural gas is an important backup energy source, and it's going to continue to be. As far as when I've spoken with my colleagues and friends in the renewable community, their biggest concern about natural gas isn't the environmental concerns; it's the cost, the low cost of natural gas. They understand the need for natural gas as a complementary source. So, when you talk about the opposition to natural gas, we're well aware of them. We need to engage with people who are persuadable on this issue, and we want to do that in communities. We need to speak with people, answer their questions about concerns that they have. But when you talk about the active opposition to natural gas, it's made out to be a bit larger than it is, in my opinion.
And yet, and I want to go down another route in a minute, but that begs the question. Certainly, the majority of Americans believe that it is important to bring together all of these various approaches into an energy solution. But you certainly have pockets of opposition that are community-based or that are based within certain issues that politically create barriers to the use of gas in areas where gas is abundant. New York is the obvious example. I think there was a sense that New York would be moving forward by now, that there would be agreement, that it would be a difficult agreement, but that there would be agreement. Obviously, the political community feels this is a bigger risk to them than they initially thought. And we seem not to be making that progress. Is that just a very short-term delay, or does that say something about long-term politics of gas?
You're talking about the political community in New York, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. That's a different animal than in most of the country, and there's very unique political considerations. It's very funny. I just read a New York Magazine article, where Governor Cuomo was going on and on about the fact that natural gas is 50% of New Yorkers' favorite, and 50% of New Yorkers oppose it. And, he's reading those polls. and I'm not sure that he has pledged to look at the facts when he makes that decision over whether hydraulic fracturing should be allowed in that state. And we take him at his word, but we think he should get to it on that decision. And that if he looks at the facts, he will decide that natural gas is produced safely and responsibly all over this country. Majority of jurisdictions have welcomed natural gas because of the economic benefits and the environmental benefits, clean air that it presents. So New York is a unique situation in my mind. I still hope that they'll look at the facts and make the right decision there.
But I'd say, Bill, just to add to that, even when it comes to deployment of renewable energy, in Canada at least, particularly I'm going to cite Ontario, there's a very organized opposition to wind power development within that jurisdiction. And we have 6 operating wind farms as Suncor. We're very proud of our stance on the renewables side, but we have to have policemen at public meetings to talk about deployment of wind power. So I think this poor state of discourse about some of these energy choices and about our energy system is at play on all segments of it.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes the media report higher profile of some things over others.
It's true, and even in the area of solar energy, there's now an emerging dialogue in the environmental community about the chemicals that are used in solar manufacturing and the overall energy footprint of solar. So it's, even in those areas that have been really favored areas of support, there's, as you get to the details, there's some issues. But you have really led the way in driving dialogue with the environmental community and among oil sands companies in Canada. With COSIA, I think you have worked quite tirelessly to draw these folks together. So obviously, you think that there is common ground out there. You think that we can move forward together.
I would say certainly that is the case. At a human level, I think people care about the same things. I mean, they care about the environment, care about health care and education for their children. There's a care about jobs. So if you can get past the positions that are held by many people, at the level of the underlying interests, often we do find there's room for engagement. But I think it's a leadership issue for me right now that each of us individually as leaders have choices of what types of behaviors that we use as to whether they're polarizing or bridge building. And I think quite simply we're not seeing enough bridge building behavior across all segments of society. You can't say it's resident in any one place. I think whether it's environment issues or even economic issues, it seems that people aren't coming together to solve those things in quite the way that they need to.
Yeah. The orphan issue in this debate over energy, and the third most abundant source of energy, perhaps the first most abundant source of energy in North America, is the one not represented on the table, and that is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is not sexy to the environmental community. It's often misunderstood because you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, you don't know what it is, and yet it's a process of innovation. It's the process of learning how to extend the productive use of natural gas, how to extend the productive use of oil sands. Is energy efficiency a part of this solution? Is there a way to bring the various sides together over that issue, or do you see energy efficiency as a competing source, if you will, that would reduce sales of gas and oil?
Personally, I think that that's a critical element of reframing the debate, that we need to bring the demand side together with the supply side in order to have a reasonable discussion. Because back to polarizing versus bridge building behaviors, when you realize, and I commented about planes, trains, and automobiles, that we're all part of the problem and we all have to be part of the solutions, that changes the nature of the engagement in quite an important way. So, and on the demand side, we do see shifts occurring that are positive. I mean, the fleet efficiency of our vehicles is certainly going in a positive manner. You know, we see technology advancements impacting on North American demand as we speak. And so I think there's an element of gravity that's going towards increased efficiency of use. Mm-hmm. But, you know, on the supply side, as far as the Keystone goes, it's also a case in Canada of wanting to maximize the value from the oil that we produce as well, and not have it discounted at a level that causes social and economic consequences that are unacceptable.
Dan, how is efficiency as an issue for your group?
Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree with Gord. You know, as we look into the future, efficiency becomes, I think, more important. And, you know, unfortunately, up until recently, we as a country, and I can't speak to Canada on this one, but we haven't changed our habits as a nation. Now there are some things that are going on, fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. You look at some of the building standards that are going on. The new buildings are much more efficient than the old ones. There's combined heat and power in manufacturing plants where they take the heat generated from the manufacturing process and they can use that as an energy source. So there's definitely opportunities there. You know, I think it's sort of evolutionary in efficiency in some ways, and there are groups that do a great job of getting efficiency programs in place that work for our country, and it's something we're going to have to do.
I want to invite the folks in the room to begin to ask questions and to participate in this discussion. I'm sure I can continue with questions, but let me give you a chance. Are there any thoughts that come up on your end? Giving you 5 seconds. There you go.
Getting back to this issue of how do we drive innovation, how do we drive R&D?
Yeah.
I think the point about finding the common ground, we can reinvest in some of this wealth creation you were talking about. I think the problem I'm seeing is that as it's good for you or some people, I guess, as the cost of natural gas goes down, we don't have the economic model right now that's necessarily pushing or driving the innovation that I think we do need around conservation is truly one of the solutions, along with, you know, mixed sources. And so can we speak about that a little bit more, because I think it's such a huge issue of driving innovation, R&D, investing in with some of this wealth that's coming out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, one example of I think a positive example of how that can be done is in Alberta, we have a $15 per ton price on carbon. And that one of the compliance mechanisms, in addition to doing internal efficiencies within our own plants, is companies can contribute into a fund that can go towards funding new technologies. So it's a technology fund. But it also funds efficiency opportunities in communities and otherwise. So that's a good example, I think, of using a price signal and then using the revenues to achieve other benefits. One other example I'll just cite quickly is our industry, the oil sands industry, has come together in a very unique way to collaborate on advancing the scale and pace of environmental performance improvement. We've created an organization called Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, or COSIA, which you can find on the internet. It's the first time globally that our industry has come together and agreed to share intellectual property to improve environmental performance in the areas of land reclamation, water, greenhouse gases, and tailings, which in the mining side of the oil sands has been one of the challenging topics for us. We've now shared $700 million of intellectual property and that's direct cost value. It's not commercial value, which would put it well over $1 billion. There's been 446 contributions of intellectual property. In the area of water, just as an example, where 140 contributions have been made, at least 6 companies have expressed interest in every one of the 140 items as being able to create improvements and value for them. And that's the acceleration effect we were hoping to achieve. Stay tuned. We have one other of the 4 areas, greenhouse gases, where we're just finalizing the legal IP sharing agreement on that, but I think that'll put us over the $1 billion mark. And I think that's a great example, though, back to this polarization versus bridge building, where collaboration in this case, I think, can achieve far more. We can achieve far more together than we can do independently. And in this particular instance, it's a case study of companies coming together to address issues of the commons, meaning the environmental conditions and the social circumstances in which we operate. It's a regional game in the oil sands arena. Our destinies are tied to the environmental cumulative impacts and the social cumulative impacts of our activities there. And Michael Porter this past fall came out for a visit and really said they can't find a global analog to this anywhere right now. So stay tuned on that, but certainly it's a great case study of a new game approach.
Yeah, I'd just say briefly that innovation is what has triggered this shale gas revolution. I know that you were asking about efficiency innovations specifically, but it's just really important to talk about the innovations that have us where we are in terms of natural gas. Jim Slutz was over at DOE when I think when they were talking about building new import terminals for natural gas. Now we're trying to find ways to export it. Why? Because we found massive amounts of natural gas that we didn't know exist, thanks to hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. And as part of that, to what Gord's has mentioned, we need to be good citizens in the communities where we operate. So a lot of the innovations regarding water recycling, reuse, treatment, pressure testing our wells, sealing off the areas where natural gas is producing from local air, land, and water, all of that is absolutely critical to our survival. We need to be good citizens in the areas where we operate, and that's all a major part of the innovation that we've developed as an industry. And I think it can't be overstated.
The importance of innovation can't be overstated here. And the problem has been that we haven't been able to connect the idea of innovation to the environmental community that's so concerned about issues relating to fossil fuels. Recently, in a battle between a group of environmentalists and about 30 companies over the use of oil sands, there were demands by the groups that the companies stop using oil sands in their supply chain. And we asked, well, what about efficiency? What about energy efficiency? And they said, well, that doesn't count because, first of all the energy efficiency opportunities out there, the biggest ones have already been done. And besides, that still keeps us tied to non-sustainable sources of fuel. Now, the reality is that innovation every year, year on year, no matter what, even if you do nothing, tends to generate a 1% gain in energy efficiency and energy productivity. It just happens. And in the 1970s, when we had oil price shocks, and in the early 1980s, we had 3 and 4% annual improvements in energy productivity. And those energy productivity gains were driven in large measure by the explosion of information technologies that happened partly as a consequence of those higher energy prices. So there's a lot of dynamics in the economy that can drive this. And by the middle of the 1980s, efficiency was the largest source of energy by far and helped to create the global glut of energy that led to lower prices, but then rebounded to more consumption. So one of the opportunities that I think is out there, and something that is in a book which will be here by the end of this session, I believe, is what we call the innovation agenda. a group of companies and activists, more than 100 overall, have signed on to policy proposals in this innovation agenda. And it's an area where we think that industry and environmental community can come together. So I would encourage any of you, if you're interested in that, pick up a copy of the book or trade cards, and we'd be happy to bring you into that discussion. You have a question.
Yeah, Jim Slutz. And I'm going to go back to Gord with it in the danger of getting too much in the weeds of this innovation group that you have. Mm-hmm. I've worked a bit in the water recycling business for shale gas in the U.S., and it's interesting the development of these small operators and the challenge of commercializing that technology. Partly it's just the the learning curve and breaking into a new industry. But what I wonder with your group, which sounds very intriguing, with companies contributing this intellectual property to be developed, how does that play with the most of those new technologies kind of come out of small companies and innovation, and so if you contribute this to a common place, with this IP, how does that play with the competitive landscape for new small companies that might be generating new ideas that are completely, the ones that aren't thought of by the new companies? And it would seem that there's a counterbalance there, that you inhibit competition by putting all that IP for free, so to speak, unless I don't understand it.
Yeah, to be very clear, too, amongst the group of 14 companies, by the way, the 14 represent 95% of the oil sands production. That agreement to share IP has very defined scope boundaries to it as to where we can share and where we compete. And third parties, it's going to be a normal course of business as to how we enter into agreements with third parties commercially around their IP. There's no expectations they're going to share in the same way that our producer group of firms are doing. So it'll be on a project basis or on a site facility basis. But an example of what we can do to help accelerate the small fellows coming forward is we're building a test center, $130 million capital facility that's a plug-and-play water technology center attached to one of our operating facilities. And so all the companies are sharing in the costs of that. Any third party can come in and do a plug-and-play test on a live oil sands site that really takes the timeline down, because one of the barriers is how do you host these third parties to do testing? And so by creating this one common facility, we'll be able to enable that.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, Steve Rockland.
It's working, I think.
All right, I'll just speak up loud.
No, it's recording for the...
Steve Rockland with the Business Civic Leadership Center. I want to continue on both of these themes, if I can, on a two-part question. One is that this is really sort of exciting, but also challenging in terms of a pre-competitive kind of industry work coming together on trying to solve these types of things. And can you talk a little bit about, can the panel talk a little bit about how the barriers can be overcome on this, whether they're legal constraints and whether public policy needs to open the door to that? And then, Bill, if you could share just a few of some of the key findings on the innovation agenda, a few takeaways, that would be great.
Terrific, terrific.
Yeah, suffice to say, putting 14 IP lawyers together and tell them to develop a sharing agreement was a voyage into the unknown. Okay, they had almost a culture shock of having been told that they're to do that. We couldn't find a global an agreement that was precedent to this anywhere, so this was starting from scratch. But we had to have competition law expertise that was party to this as well, because again, back to the boundaries on where we can share and where we can't, those have to be set with absolute precision. The Competition Bureau within Canada had to be consulted on what we were aspiring to do and how we were going about doing it. and they don't really give permission, but they can choose not to object, and so we've carved out certainty as much as we can do, and every person that's party to this COSIA entity goes through competition law training in order to ensure proper due diligence, that we're not going to venture in conversations into areas in which we're not allowed. So there's risk mitigation strategies that have to be part of the design of this type of entity. So not without some complexities, but when we're putting our subject matter experts together now under these ground rules, and they're able to share ideas and brainstorm about new opportunities, we're seeing the 2 + 2 = 5 type of outcome when you put that talent together, and they start exchanging. And so that's the magic of it that's making it worthwhile. I would say stay tuned.
You asked about the innovation agenda, and what we found. Part of this is technical. Part of it is political. On the political side, we all know that in a gridlocked political system like we have today, it's far easier to defeat legislation than it is to pass legislation, certainly at the federal level, but also at other levels. And in order to pass legislation, often you need to line up a lot of interest groups that need their share out of the process. And when you got to get all your votes from one party, depending on who's in charge, the interest group, the need to cater to interest groups becomes even greater. And so the consequence of that is that what can get through, the only legislation, it seems, that can get through the process is that which is expensive and ineffective at the same time. It has to be expensive because you've got to pass along enough goodies to the left and right, interest groups to get it passed, and it has to be ineffective because if you make systemic changes that are threatening to any of those interest groups, then they will oppose it. So this formula of if you want to pass a bill, it has to be expensive and ineffective, it doesn't lead to the best public policy outcomes. And this is why we have to bring these two sides together. Now, the exercise on the innovation agenda was to say, well, what could we do that's inexpensive, that costs less, that would actually advance innovation. The objective being about a 3% per year level of innovation. 3%, every year, carbon goes 3% further than it did the year before. Natural gas, oil sands, oil, and so on goes 3% further than the year before. We did that in the 70s and the 80s, and it helped to produce an economic revolution that nobody today would want to turn back the clock on. So we know these potential revolutions are out there, and using McKinsey data from some great studies that I would love to share with you, we could achieve that 3% a year. We do that for 50 years, and what you find, based on McKinsey's data, is that you've paid off the debts, the economic debts that the nation has accrued. You've also cut our carbon footprint about 80%. So you've achieved what the environmentalists want and what the scientists say that we need, and you've also achieved what the conservatives want, which is some sanity in the amount of money that we spend and in our fiscal side. So this is how the sides can be brought together. The problem is that along the way, everybody has to give up a little bit of what they want to preserve. And we all want to preserve little bits of our current life and our current ways of doing business. But it is a political challenge that we will be happy to take together, because no company wants to preserve its underlying deficits to the point where it collapses. Certainly not to where the economy collapses or the environment collapses. So we all want to do it, but it is going to take coalition building like we haven't seen in the last generation. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Vince Brown with Planetary Power. I understand, and listening to you all speak, I understand there's a lot of engagement with activism and with government in terms of eliminating regulation or trying to get the best types of regulations given the circumstances. What I'm trying to understand is what type of engagement are you doing with the consumer and the business owners who are actually looking at what their costs are each month or each year that they're spending for energy. Because these are the people that you really need to convince. These are the people that actually are the ones that push their politicians to make laws to support you. Instead, I think, and I'm speaking simply as the devil's advocate here, what they see is conspicuous profitability. You talk about efficiency, you talk about new sources of energy. They don't see it in their monthly bills. The small business owner, the consumer, the guy who drives his car is seeing rising energy costs. And while there may be these efficiencies and these things may be happening, I don't think that we're doing a good job of conveying the message. What we're saying essentially is that, well, it would be much worse if we weren't doing this. And I don't think that that really is going to strike a chord with the people who really push the politicians, which are not the activists as much as they'd like to be.
Yeah. Comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and it's really a hard one for us to overcome. I mean, we see the price of gas going down, but and it is reflected in people's bills up to an extent. But when I speak with people like you, and you say, "Well, I'm not seeing it," it's you know, it's a little bit discouraging. You took my answer away, actually, which is that, but for low-cost natural gas, our energy prices would just be tremendously high, and it's a hard challenge that you've presented, and I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for you.
We have a political process that makes it really difficult to reach out to mainstream folks and organize the mainstream. I think that with gridlock, there's a tendency on both sides to play narratives that just appeal to one side or the other. So we all know the left distrusts corporations, and so the narrative is always there's an evil corporation that is behind this, and they're going to do harm, and therefore you have to stop the corporate enemy. And on the right, the narrative is there's a big government out there that's going to oppress you, and you've got to stop the mortal enemy. And you can play those sides, but what you lose are the folks in the middle who distrust corporations, but they understand that they're a legitimate part of the process, distrust government, but they understand they're a legitimate part of the process, and want to navigate through that. I think the vast majority of Americans are in that camp somewhere. So somehow we have to move past this political gridlock that prevents us from communicating to those consumers so that they can put the pressure on the politicians. The politicians are afraid of being primaried. They're afraid of alienating that base on either the left or the right. It would be healthier for the nation if they were afraid of the middle, of the folks who can see the truth and the falsehoods on both sides.
Bill, I think that's I just want to comment. I think that's a great point. And people like you are the people that we're trying to reach, and it is very, very difficult to do that. If we could reach you all and people in your position, again, I go back to people who are persuadable. Our job would be so much easier, and it is. I mean, every marketing organization in the world wants to reach people like you, and none of them are able to do it. So, I just think you're on the mark with your point there.
One question though, the folks that are persuadable, we find in our discussions, we talk to plenty of ideologues on all sides, and we see what they all have legitimate points. They're all representing an extreme form of an idea that has some truth to it. Corporations can be threatening, government can be threatening. We find that maybe 80% of the people in these movements are persuadable, but they don't seem persuadable at the beginning. You see a Tea Party, active group, you see Occupy, and you say none of those people can be persuaded. And yet, in the process of engagement, we find most of them can be persuaded. Even if they go away seemingly unpersuaded, they come back with a different, more nuanced understanding. How is the natural gas sector reaching out to folks who seem to be diametrically opposed to natural gas, but who may be persuadable?
Well, we try to stay away from the diabolicals, for sure.
They do too. That's why you guys never meet.
No, part of it is just our companies do a lot of town hall meetings in communities where we're operating. It's really important to reach out in these communities. If you look on YouTube, you can find these meetings. Some of them get sort of hostile. Our companies go in and they do it. They take the questions. They try to be good citizens in the communities where we operate. I do think that there's a small, very small segment of the population who we're not going to reach. So whether it be through advertising campaigns or through earned media, where we're talking to reporters in communities, doing editorial boards, these types of town hall meetings. These are the things that we're doing to try to reach people who have not made up their minds. But it's not easy. It's really not easy.
The town hall meeting approach, obviously necessary in communities where you're developing, and yet sometimes town hall meetings can often be just positioned as opportunities for formal groups to get together and oppose, and for folks, even if they're in a minority, to show up at the town hall meeting to make their case. There's not a lot of really genuine give and take. I wonder if what does the gas industry and what does the oil sands sector do to create some of those relationships outside those formal processes that lead to more discovery of common ground? Maybe Gord, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say the state of the playing field right now is that a lot of that comes down to one-on-ones or very small group discussions where you can not have a soapbox that people are going to either use or misuse, and where you can actually have an adult conversation about not just what people believe, but why, and kind of build from there. It's diplomacy, I guess, at a fundamental level, but it's difficult. And for groups or even individuals within certain groups that are willing to come to a dialogue, even at that small scale, they get demonized by their peers as selling the farm, or gee, you're going to come up with some grand deal that is going to undermine our interests. So the trust level is low almost anywhere you look, within sectors and between sectors. Yeah. But I think the only way to get to trust at all is the one-on-one.
And some patience with it, because we find that people are very tribal, and when an environmental activist will meet with a company, we often have let's say there's 5 major activists against a particular project. We'll talk to them all, and they'll all say, "Well, I'll talk to the opposition, but don't tell any of my colleagues that I've done this." And companies will be in the same position sometimes. So I'll meet with them, but don't talk about it. Because there is the tribal impulse when they go back to the tribe says, are you, edging outside, you seem, did you like that? Gord is, he's kind of the devil, isn't he? He's like, Dan is, should you be talking to those people? And so they tend to, and many companies have experienced this, they have a great meeting, and then the next thing they know, this group has issued a press release condemning them. And they say, what happened? We had this good meeting. And the dynamic is usually they've gone back to their group. They've said, you know what, we have common ground with the company that we thought we were diametrically opposed to. And they say, you are an idiot. Let's get, prove that you are still with us, and then, you have that happen. So it takes some months. How's the gas industry dealing with this phenomenon?
Well, again, I don't think that the level of conflict is as high as some people would suggest. I'm not denying we have opposition. Major environmental groups have expressed opposition to natural gas, so I'm not denying their existence. But again, this is a great time for us to be in the natural gas industry. We actually get a better reception in most places where we go. We do hold the public town hall meetings where we get slammed by unhappy landowners from time to time. We also go to local chambers of commerce. You know, we meet with state, county, local legislators, you know, judges where they have some relevant role. And I should say, I think in Texas there's some, I don't know enough about there's some elected officials who, county judges of some sort, but in any case, we meet with all kinds of people all the time, one-on-one, in small groups, large groups, and generally what we get is a favorable response. Mm-hmm. So I don't see the us versus them being as pervasive as some people would like everybody to think.
Mm-hmm. A couple of other quick reflections, Bill. I think one opportunity area is to define outcomes that are of mutual interest. Mm-hmm. And use those real outcomes to help see if you can achieve some alignment. So you can agree to disagree on certain matters, but if you can define a particular outcome that you're trying to achieve, I think that's the real magic. Now, I want to highlight another dilemma, and not having an answer to it, but I think social media is a part of the world now that has complicated the relationships tremendously. It just seems like we deal at a very superficial soundbite level then, and it's and misinformation travels, you know, just as quickly as accurate information. I think we struggle with the facts of certain of these debates. Who is the honest broker of the facts? And I'll tell you, as a practitioner, it's just complicated things very significantly. And anyone who has the magic answer to that in the audience, I'll be all ears.
Yeah. Me too. Other questions?
Not so much a question, but a comment. And this goes back around to the question of how do we convey the benefits of some of the energy, as an energy presence we're in. And in the comment that, well, all we can tell people is what it would have been, what it potentially would have been without. I think we are, if we take that position, we're underselling what history has out there. We have a lot of lessons both in what we've learned from policy actions in the past. We're just looking at how the energy industry has evolved. And Dan had mentioned my role in when I was at DOE in working on LNG imports. And I think that's a good lesson. We go back and in the early to mid 2000s, which were just a half dozen years ago, we were looking at importing up to 20% of our natural gas. And natural gas prices were $8 an MCF or higher, so more than twice what we are now. And if you look at the number of manufacturing jobs we shed during that period, it was very significant. Tying that back into innovation, it truly was those higher prices that drove the innovation, drilling and multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. It took 20 years for the actual shale gas to be developed or more, but it was really those higher prices that drove companies to say, hey, we can make money doing this. And then, of course, after doing it, the price of production went down. But it was that price response. So I think there is some both a lesson that markets work to foster innovation, and the other thing is we need to be careful with regulation on that because markets work.
So given that markets work, and I think there's a great receptivity in the environmental community among young people in particular that markets do work. The markets are like ecosystems. They're these feedback and adaptation systems that tend to find lots of creative solutions along the way. And yet, when you go out with the message that it's markets that work, that often turns off folks on the left or folks that are concerned about business because they translate markets into big corporations. And the political system translates free markets into big corporations sometimes too. So how do you convey that idea that markets are creative the same way natural ecosystems are to these communities so that they begin to see promise in markets versus the challenges? Yeah.
If I could just add a point to that, if you look at it was our the way we first implemented the Clean Air Act was a way with the, we got much higher in air quality because of a market-based system.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to say very quickly, when we were talking about innovations and the question about sort of the entrepreneurialism and the IP things that you guys are working on, one of the things that we've seen is just a flood, excuse the term, but a flood of companies that have come in to deal with water innovations. It's like the dot-com boom almost with hydraulic fracturing. There are so many companies running into the space, and there are some great ideas coming out, and those ideas are actually being purchased and utilized in very fast order. So people are seeing these markets actually work. And it's a very good story for our country, and it's something that I'd encourage people to look at as a example of how innovation, entrepreneurship, and markets can all come together and tell a great story for our country.
It is a great story, and one of the challenges that we find in stakeholder engagement is that there's a tendency, certainly on the part of companies that are more engineering-oriented and science-oriented, to do the solution and then bring it to the stakeholder community and say, look what a great job we're doing. And because so many of these conflicts are based on mistrust to begin with, often that doesn't work because the groups don't trust the industry. And I acknowledge you're right that great support for natural gas. It's a great time to be in the natural gas industry. There's a minority of people that are opposed, but they are a vocal minority, and they'll continue to be challenging. It seems to me there's a great opportunity here if you can engage some of the communities of interest here in this process of innovation, and so that they co-own some of these ideas that are reducing impact on water. Because if there's an issue on which the industry's future is critically dependent, it's the perception of your impact on water.
Yeah, I guess I want to go back for a second and sound sort of a conciliatory tone towards some of the environmental groups. Deep dark secret here, used to be a journalist, and I actually still go to lunch, clandestine lunches with a lot of my friends in the environmental community. And they're not as antagonistic towards natural gas when I sit down with them as they are in the press releases that we all get to see. So I actually have, it's not antagonism towards environmentalists, it's actually optimism that we're all going to, as you said in the very beginning, come together on a solution that really works for North America, for our country. And so I know the critics are out there, but I do think that there's a lot of opportunities based on my personal interactions with folks in the environmental community for us to move forward on energy in a very positive way.
Janet McGilligan. I work with Bill as and on the advisory board with Future 500. And as a note to how markets work, I always bring up Somalia, which has an absence of government regulation, has the best cell phone services in all of Africa, and that you can go to a bank, or what they call a bank, in Mogadishu, put money in to give to your mother way out in the villages, and she has it an hour later. So when they want something to work, it works. But the question I really wanted to ask was concerning exporting LNG. What are the issues that are going to face us as a country in exporting LNG? Because, I mean, the whole idea for most Americans that we can be an energy exporter is astonishing. I know it's true, but what do you see as the next 5 years maybe in the exportation, and how long will it be before we really see a major market for exporting?
Yeah, I wondered if I would get that question. It's a good question, and there's a lot of complexities involved because there's some opposition to exporting. I think that's a great example of where people are yelling at each other from different sides, and we all want the same thing, which is affordable energy for us and a better economy as well. And so what we'd like to see is we'd like to see the Energy Department approve the permits, allow us to move forward with exporting natural gas, and we believe that the market is going to dictate the appropriate level of exports in a way that I think we all can be happy with. I think people recognize that natural gas is at a price it's just unusually low, too low. We need to find markets. And again, going back to the Potential Gas Committee report, we have so much natural gas in this country. And even the people who are opposing exports will grant me that. So I think we're going to find the right level. We want DOE to approve those permits. We want to be able to move forward on these facilities. But we also understand that this is not an unlimited market. You know, the market for natural gas is primarily here in the United States. And we're proud of that.
Bruce, I noticed you had a question, then you.
I was thinking about your title related to everything we heard, and I think I just want to commend Bill and the Chamber of Commerce for getting experts up to talk about economic and environmental improvements in such a way. The question is to see what you guys think about the role of the Department of Defense in the pursuit of the energy mix, and see if, you know, here in Washington, I read Senator Warner's work with Pew Charitable Trust, where DOD and the services and the black box organizations are committing to renewables at 25% by 2025. And I have no doubt that they have the discipline, unlike the political process, to deploy that as an actuality. Meanwhile, my work is often working for energy companies like Suncor, great energy companies, or utilities, where it's very difficult to come up with a stated goal on what renewables should be. Do you guys have any comments on that, how the Defense Department can give an objective and actually run biofuel battles? So this report is called From Barracks to Battlefields by Pew, and it reminds me of this title, Bricks and Sticks, because it's almost as if DOD is saying we can do it 75% on man-made energy, energy that we discover, and 25% on sticks, which is an amazing thing for me to think about, considering that I thought our entire defense system was fossil-based. So any comments about that?
Well, maybe try it. I won't pretend to have deep insights on the Department of Defense per se. I would premise, though, they're probably quite linked to the global scenario of moving from 7 to 9 billion people on the planet, and the fact we're going to need a lot more energy in every kind of form, and that you could literally end up with challenge on in an aggressive manner. And so I would guess that that's probably quite a driver. And it's an important perspective to keep in mind as we think about our energy future, because energy is so linked to development. You aren't going to be able to deprive people of energy. We need to create more of it.
Yeah, the DOD study is definitely, Gordon, about more, not more energy.
Exactly. And more optionality, more choice.
I just add to that, I think the Department of Defense is the single biggest energy user in the world. And so if they figure it out, that'll be a good sign for the rest of us.
That's why I wanted to bring it up. It's a fantastic study.
I don't know whether it's going to be 25% renewables or biofuels or natural gas in airplanes, for example. Natural gas vehicles, we'd take that. But it's all going to be, we'd
take that.
It's all going to be part of the solution, and including, you know, oil sands from Canada, biofuels, natural gas. And so I really hope they can figure it out, because I think they can help the rest of the world.
The fascinating thing about the Department of Defense and military applications as a way to invest in innovation and breakthrough innovation is that, you know, on the left there's a basic political science here. You know, on the left tends to think people are selfless, and so you give them money to do something good, and they'll go out and do something good with it. The right tends to believe people are selfish, so if you give people money to do something good, they'll go out and spend it on themselves. And the military kind of brings that together. So if you're going to throw money at a problem, to some degree, I'm not sure how comfortable I feel about this, but throw it to the military, because the military, if anybody figures out how to make solar energy work in a distant field with folks, distant from any infrastructure, so that it actually fulfills a mission, it's the military that's gonna do that. And then once they've developed it at extraordinary cost, you can reproduce it at minimal cost, for the economy. So there is some interesting promise. If you're gonna be throwing money at a problem, I don't know. Maybe we should throw it at the military and and see what they do with it. So. Yes.
I'm Marlon Harrison with Shell Oil Company and Motiva Enterprises. Dan, this question is for you, and I think you touched upon it a bit a moment ago. Could you give us a view on how quickly you see penetration of LNG into the transportation fleet? Or do you see penetration of LNG into the transportation fleet?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We do. We see companies making decisions, Waste Management, for example. I think FedEx has done some things, UPS has done some things to buy fleets of natural gas vehicles. There are natural gas corridors in places like Texas that are either on now or coming on. Utah to Las Vegas to Los Angeles. So I see it being something that gets built, the infrastructure gets built not one station at a time, but through corridors. Trucking fleets will see that they can fuel their trucks across a big run of freight, regular route freight, so those places where you run a regular route and come back to your depot or whatever every night. So we see that being the start of it, and from there, there's a lot of natural gas that could be burned just by trucks alone. I think ultimately, people will start running their automobiles on natural gas, but not in the next, not prolifically in the next 5 years.
Next question.
I know we're getting to the end of the session, but I really love a lot of what you all had to say, but I guess my biggest suggestion is to change the language. When we refer to, first of all, full disclosure, I'm a facilitator. I actually work for ecology and environment, so I actually facilitate these conversations a lot. But I think by shifting the language in terms of how we refer to the different groups, in terms of, those environmental activists or those corporate people, or, how we find that common ground and change the language about it, and it really has to start, I think, with folks like you by using new terminology and terminology that everyone can understand. And it isn't just an environmental issue, it's actually a human issue. And we are really looking at human behavior. And so a lot of people only have the old bad stories to focus on right now. And so you're trying to undo a lot of the bad stuff that happened in Pennsylvania or Ohio when it comes to fracking. And so putting the good stories out there in a very public, and that's how you can use social media positively, I think. There's not enough good stories out there. Yeah. There's not enough common language or new language being used around these terms like innovation in other areas. And so for me, you're all saying the right things, but maybe to a new set of people and changing a language that people can understand better is my biggest
I'm really glad you said that. We're actually looking at that issue. It seems odd, but we actually are looking at that. Give you one example, and it's not related to how you deal with people. But it's word use. Some people think, well, fugitive emissions is a terrible word. So now we're looking at like, well, what else can we say? So, but it also applies to environmental groups and other people who may disagree with us. And we're very active in social media, but some of our terms, like innovation, I feel is some people view innovation as a euphemistic term for business, making money, or so. I don't know what it is, but it's not quite the right term. It's not soft and cuddly. Yeah. So we got to figure some of that out.
Humanize it. Try to make it something that people can all start with that.
No, it's a great point.
Place of agreement.
I
Thanks.
think your term humanize is really key here. We like to tell companies that if you forget everything else about how to engage stakeholders, word number one is humanize, because when people are coming into a room and they've already demonized you, they're not going to accept all the rational, logical things you have to say. It really is humanizing both sides, and that means being genuine, small groups, one-on-one, over beers, over coffee, but in situations where you can actually connect as people. And then we find 80% of the people can really get on board, and some you'll never persuade, but there are always possibilities.
Yeah, and if I could just make a quick build on that, I think also framing matters. So, in Canada right now, we're trying to create a dialogue about Canada's energy future and creating an energy strategy for the country. And we're finding that has convening power, that people can come to that table. And I think it's because it's involving a positive vision. I think a positive vision always trumps a negative one. But if you think of where we get stuck often, especially on environment-related issues, it's dominated by negative visioning. Imagine a firm whose vision statement is premised on avoidance of bankruptcy. It doesn't exactly, bring people's best creative energies forward, right? I mean, yes, it's a bad outcome that we want to avoid, but is that the way we're going to harness people's creative energies? Or, Martin Luther King, it was "I have a dream," not "I have a nightmare." And but think of the language that we use on environment often, and it's very much in that we get stuck in that negative mode. So,
and terms and ideas get demonized along the way. So, and some on the right, the term sustainable is now a demon word, and it's a code word, which is interesting. And thank goodness, people are finding problems with it, because it's such an uninspiring term. Bill McKibben has said, if somebody asked him how his marriage was, and he said, "Well, it's sustainable," like, what is that? Is that what you want? So I think maybe it's time for the sustainability movement to rethink its languaging as well and come forward with something that's a little more visionary. Every social movement goes through these two phases. The first phase is the combative anti-movement to tear down the status quo, and the second phase is to build the new. The problem is, if that actually works out in real life, you tear down the status quo and then you all collapse. So, what we need, as Gord says, is a common vision. And when you set out a common vision, then people say, "I can see my future in this vision." And then they're willing to work together, and that brings people together like nothing else does. So I congratulate the folks on the committee here. I thank the Chamber of Commerce for creating the space for this event, and to BCLC as well for being such a good partner with us. We look forward to the discussions